Series 4 of the 50 Faces podcast is sponsored by Baillie Gifford. Baillie Gifford is a long-term investment manager dedicated to discovering the innovations and change makers that deliver exceptional growth opportunities for its clients. Our next guest started out studying international law, but her career brought her to local government in particular. Hear about her vision for greater pooling, improved governance, and the future of local investments. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Jo Donnelly, who's the CEO at the London Pensions Fund Authority, a role she has held since April of this year. She was previously head of pensions at the local government association, and prior to that worked in HM Treasury at the NHS pension scheme and at the UK Home Office. Welcome, Jo. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Aoife. It's great to join you.
Well, let's start by talking a little bit about your background. Can you talk about where you grew up, what you studied, and how you came to enter the civil service and ultimately pensions?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in York, up in the north of England. Mum, dad, older brother, so sort of stereotypical nuclear family. I was lucky to have a sort of stable, normal, loving childhood. I count myself lucky for that because not everyone has that experience. We spent a lot of weekends at motorcycle racing events. So that was somewhere where my whole family kind of got involved and volunteered. So that got me used to working with adults when I was relatively young and doing something very different to what most people would experience in life. I went to a comprehensive school in York. It was a good school and I did okay. I went to university. I studied Lancaster, did international law and politics, and economics was my major, which I found really quite challenging as much as I loved the other subjects. I then went on and did a master's degree after I'd done a year of sort of doing some temping work in between the two degrees. I spent most of my time sort of temping in the NHS, which was a really sort of interesting way of learning about the NHS on the front line. You see it in a way you don't when you use the NHS as a patient. So that was a very interesting experience. I then did my master's, again, sort of focusing more on international law in that, and managed to obtain a distinction in that, which was I was very proud of after getting a 2-2 for my first degree.
Fantastic. Well, already a few little rabbit holes I'd like to go down, and we're hearing that. And let's start with the first one, the motorbike racing. So did you race motorbikes yourself, ride them?
No, it was more my dad. He was from Northern Ireland, so most people who've grown up in Northern Ireland will have at some point probably seen a motorbike race held relatively local to them. So it was just something that he was into. And then Mum always told me that once my brother and I got to about 10 or 11, they decided to take us along so that we could get involved. But yeah, it's a huge part of my life, always has been and is, but not something I talk very much about in the work environment. So people are often surprised when I say that.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating. Well, I always think, I mean, even if you're not riding them yourself, there's a certain amount of risk taking that any motorbike rider has to obviously bear in mind and internalize. And how do you think about this inherently risky pursuit?
Well, I did ride a moped when I was 16, so I could get out and about and be mobile without relying on my parents so much and public transport. But it was very much something, as soon as I could get inside a warm, safe car, that I was leaving behind. So I have the utmost respect for people who undertake these very dangerous sports, but it's certainly not something I would want to pursue in my life. But I enjoy the thrill of watching, definitely.
Fantastic. And then the NHS front line, being inside versus outside, and anything that taught you about workplace best practice that you took since you've been in public service roles since then too?
Yeah, I think what the NHS taught me was just how difficult it is for such large organisations to work in the right way. There's just so much that has to fit together. It is by its very nature. There's always going to be a lack of productivity and it's not going to run smoothly. And so I sort of learned how difficult it was. I think that's the most important thing to take away from it. So when you see a lot of difficulties in the NHS and you understand government wanted to try and reform this, that and the other, if you've seen it from the inside, you know just how challenging that is and how difficult it is.
And certainly it may not be a well-oiled machine, but it is a machine which is still
It
operating
is.
and delivering. And
Hmm.
I think that's, as you think, is something kind of awe-inspiring. And the last thread I'd love to pull on a little is the international law. I have a separate legal series where we've had some international lawyers. And what always strikes me about that field is it is so, in a way, some of the issues are so long dated and
Hmm.
really bigger than all of us. We're looking at international law, justice, treaties, etc. And I would
Mm.
think that local government is almost in a way the antithesis of that, in that it's more granular, kind of, ground level. Do you ever think about your international law training or what interested you now in this current role?
Not so much in this current role, although that kind of legal background, I think, was always a very helpful grounding. Really, my original passion would have been to work for an international organization. So I would have loved to have joined the UN, WLO, ILO. When I was thinking about this, I thought, well, I didn't realize it back then, but I was already into acronyms when I was in my early 20s, and clearly pensions is very acronym focused. But unfortunately for me, my family, we were working class. There wasn't a lot of money around. So I wasn't able to go to Geneva or New York to do any of the internships that were on offer to sort of people who'd done a master's degree like me. So I opted to sort of try and join the Foreign Office instead on their fast stream. I tried 3 times and they rejected me 3 times. So that was another crushing of a dream, which was a shame. And then I ended up entering the civil service via just seeing a newspaper advert for something they called presenting officers, which was not something I'd ever heard of. And that was how I entered the Home Office in the Asylum and Immigration Directorate there. It sounded like an intriguing kind of role, had some sort of legal element to it. And I didn't really realise at the time exactly what the role involved. May not have gone for it if I had, but it was working as an advocate in tribunals effectively, cross examining applicants for asylum and immigration visas. So it was a really interesting job and a role I took to pretty well and enjoyed.
Well, I suppose the Foreign Office's loss is local government's gain, and
Indeed.
certainly the LGPS's gain. But it is interesting what you mentioned about dealing with asylum applications and visas, because I think I have had a green card and then citizenship of the US, and every individual case is so complex and so different. And
Yeah.
it really, I think, that kind of reminder of the individual nature of every single beneficiary or just recipient of these pensions, I think that's an important kind of a reality check
Yes. Yes.
that
It's always a
informs what we do.
thread. Yeah. And I think the interesting thing about that job was that there comes a time, and I could already see it when I was relatively new to it, dealing with the judges and the other advocates who were arguing for the appellants. I was representing the Home Office as the decision maker, that the attitude was, I could tell people have been dealing with these cases for a long time. And it was something that happened to me. And I very much felt myself becoming dehumanized and desensitized to some of these cases. And so it got to a point where I thought, now I'm no longer necessarily seeing this human being in front of me. I'm thinking of them in a different way. That was when I realized I needed to step away from it and do something else, because that wasn't how I wanted to operate in my working life and be day to day. So that was when
And
I found pensions.
yes, yeah, and I certainly, maybe pensions is the best of both worlds. So you're making an impact on everyday lives, but without having to be in the kind of cut and thrust of
Mm,
every appeal.
mm,
I'd love to then move to this. Congratulations, first of all, on the becoming CEO at LPFA. Great. As I said, the Foreign Office has lost very much
mm.
our gain, and great to have someone with such experience and leading at the helm now at this point. What would you say is at the forefront of your mind in this role? And can you maybe set the scene for us a little bit about the LPFA?
Yeah. So I've been here 3 months now. It's been really busy, really interesting, really exciting. So I've been getting to know the team, getting to know the organisation, understanding how it operates, and really getting into the detail of the fund, how it runs, how it's run. And obviously, I've come in at the point when we're doing the valuation as well. So that's something I've been getting into sort of almost straight away. And there's plenty of other kind of ongoing issues, as we all know, in the LGPS to get my teeth into. A particular project internally is changing our operating model within the organisation, so how the teams are structured. LPFA's history, we've existed for 35 years. At some point in the past, we had all of our kind of services outsourced. Now we have our services in-house in terms of sort of finance team and our risk team and our employer management team. We still outsource our administration to LPPA and obviously our investment to LPPI. But the fund grew relatively quickly in terms of the number of people who were employed and the services we deliver. And so it sort of grew without a real structure around that. So I'm sort of looking now at how we operate and how we can streamline that and make that more effective. More transparency as well is something that we're keen to get really embedded in the fund as well.
And of course, LPFA was one of the founder shareholders of LPPI. Can you just give us a sense of its size as well as funding level and just maybe
As you say, we're a 50-50 shareholder with Lancashire County Council and LPP, which owns LPPA and LPPI. Our fund is slightly smaller than Lancashire. We're 8 billion under management at the moment. We have just over 100,000 members, of whom 20,000 are active. The other sort of 80,000 are split roughly equally between pensioners and deferreds. And we have over 100 employers in the fund, which I know isn't that much compared to some other administering authorities. And we have some really interesting organisations. I was having a look, preparing for this conversation, I was having a look through our rates and adjustment certificate. And the UK Anti-Doping Agency is one of our employers in the fund, which slightly feels a bit random. But the ones that people might be more familiar with are those kind of cross-London organisations like the GLA, like TfL, London councils. We have the non-sort of operational staff from London Fire Brigade and the Met Police. We have a number of universities who are members, academies, museums, and a lot of other sort of small organisations too. The funding level at last valuation was 128%, having gone up from 106% in the 2019 valuation. So, and hopefully it will be either roughly the same or a bit higher at this valuation, but obviously we're working on that at the moment. And we are cash flow negative, like a number of funds are now. And our sort of equity split, our asset allocation, we have about 50% of the fund in public equities, and then smaller allocations, about 15% in credit, 13% infrastructure, 10% real estate, and then other small allocations to some other asset classes.
Thank you to Baillie Gifford for sponsoring Series 4 of the 2025 50 Faces podcast. I sat down with Matthew Coyle, Client Relationship Director at Baillie Gifford, and asked him, when Baillie Gifford speaks about investing in sustainable companies, what sustainable means to them.
Yeah, so we do run some dedicated sustainable and impact investing strategies. But for all of our strategies, sustainability is one of a number of factors that we assess. So as long-term investors, we look for aligned management teams who are overseeing sensible business models, and that's a really important consideration. Our typical holding period is well over 5 years, and in some cases, we've held companies since the 1990s. So it's vital that we back companies that can thrive over the long term, rather than just trying to speculate over a short 6-month period.
And now, back to the show. And how about your approach to sustainable or investing, impact investing, or I suppose responsible investing broadly, as well as local investing? Plenty of opportunities in London, I would think.
Yes, definitely. Collaboration really is important to us when we think about local and investing and impact as well. Although we are, like most LGPS funds, we're a global investor, but we have about 13% of our fund invested in the UK, which is comparatively pretty high compared to other sort of London funds. We've got a dashboard that we've developed that's on our website as well, so that our members and visitors to our website can have a look at our UK-based investments and see where they are and a bit more about all of those projects. I think that's a really incredibly valuable tool for just a really easy way for people to understand where the fund is invested. I think that's been really impactful with our membership. We're also really proud to have been a founder member of GLIL as well, which is another collaboration between ourselves and some of the Northern Pool Fund members, GMPF and Merseyside. And that's done a lot of work in UK infrastructure and other broader projects in the EU as well. We're invested in the London Fund as well, which is another collaboration between LPPI and the London CIV. And that has investors, including ourselves and a few of the other London boroughs. And that fund concentrates on positive social impact as well as investment returns. And so we have some housing in that. We have some regeneration projects. It's invested in one of the new build tower blocks in London that's very, very environmentally friendly. So really proud to be part of some of those projects. We tend to look at impact with a lowercase I rather than a capital I, but we understand the importance of investing in impactful projects and demonstrating real world outcomes and positive outcomes from our investments. It's really important that we're responsible asset owners and we think about the long-term impacts of the investments we're holding now and make sure that we're affecting real world change where we can through those investments.
No, that's really interesting. And then, of course, before this, you were well known in these circles, and a lot of us knew you from your role at the local government association. Was there anything that maybe that role taught you in terms of engagement, pensions policy? What did you take from that role to this one?
I took an awful lot. And I think one of the things I'd come to think during my time at Treasury, which I then made sure continued after that, was the importance of talking to people and being open and developing those relationships. Central government can often be quite closed and opaque. And I saw the value in involving people in that policy making journey. It's not always possible. Some policy has to be developed confidentially, but there's an awful lot of areas where you can involve key stakeholders and discuss potential policy ideas with people who are actually going to be implementing those policy ideas when they become regulation and when they become guidance. And I think that makes the whole policy making journey better at the outset. So I understood the importance of listening, of open communication, building relationships, building that trust with people. And I think I made sure when I moved on from Treasury that the people that I left in the team there were continuing reaching out. I helped them make connections within the LGPS once I'd left. And I think that's been, I don't want to say transformative, that feels too strong, but I think we're in a really much better place now with how fund officers and pools are involved in that policy-making journey than they were at the outset of pooling, let's say, when I was on the Treasury side of it as a relatively new member of the team then.
I think it probably has been transformative. And I think pooling is probably a very good case in point, whereby there needs to be a kind of constant interaction, understanding, shared best practice between the stakeholders to get to an optimal outcome. And that was my last question on the fund there is pooling. And, the stage you're at there, as clearly we're at a transformational point for the LGPS itself in regards to future pooling.
Yeah, so obviously we're part of the LPPI pool along with Lancashire and Berkshire. So we're the smallest pool in terms of number of members, certainly, partner funds. But we already operate the government's preferred model. So in terms of build, there isn't much more for LPPI to develop in that sense. However, we need to build scale as we hope to bring in more partner funds into the pool. So we're well positioned, I think, at this point in time. But obviously the decisions the government's made around Access and Brunel, I mean, a lot of my time here at LPFA has actually been involved with those discussions with the pool and with potential new partners. And so it's been an iterative process, but really important. Yeah, so very interesting times working with lots of people and seeing that perspective from this side, from the fund side, the pool side, and the government policy side.
It is. Well, just today, as we're recording this, I released my podcast with Joe Kempton. And another great example of leadership, institutional memory, and just steady pair of hands there in terms of, her role at Lincolnshire, Border to Coast, as a shareholder, Border to Coast. So it gives all of us who watch from the outside tremendous confidence to see people like you, like Joe, involved in these discussions. And I think that should not be underestimated. So thank you for your service in that respect. And the last question on getting back to that sustainability theme, because often ESG, we roll the social improvements, the diversity, the cognitive diversity, the other diversity into that. Given you've been in many different roles in the pensions and government kind of roles, any observation about diversity of the industry, whether it's improved throughout your career? Any comment to make there?
Yeah, I think it is improving, but I definitely think there's more that can be done. And I think, one of the things I've thought about a lot in my career, and probably more as I joined the central government departments and was in a policy-making role, it's about invisible diversity as well as visible diversity. And by that, I mean sort of diversity of thought. So when I was in Treasury, it was a visibly diverse department, which was brilliant. But it wasn't necessarily as diverse in terms of backgrounds and in terms of where people had worked before, where people had grown up. Me, an older woman with a northern accent from a working class background, there was only a few of us, it's fair to say, in Treasury. So I think I always brought something a bit different to the discussions and always brought a perspective that was really valuable Well, at least I thought it was anyway. Having had that experience of working, not only in public service on the front line, but in a pension scheme. I'd worked on the NHS pension scheme directly, and I'd seen how, Treasury policy, Treasury decisions had impacted us as we tried to apply that in practice and tried to put that into the form of a letter that the administrator sends out to the member, for example. How do you translate things like the McLeod policy? How do you boil that down for members, trying to make that as easy to understand as possible? So, yeah, I think in terms of having those backgrounds, it is really helpful. I think from my perspective, paid internships is something I hugely support. I've already said travel costs, accommodation costs, those are the things that I just couldn't afford. My family couldn't support me to do. And it's been really great to see more paid internships kind of coming through, but I think it is really key. And it does mean that people can have the same opportunities regardless of their background. I think that's really valuable.
So key. And also I like under the current pooling model, the devolved model of having centres in Wales and Leeds, etc., that of course is enabling more diversity in the management side of things. So getting people from the north. And then also I think what you said is key, that ability to translate complex policy, and it is quite complex and sometimes jargonistic policy, into something that can be understood by stakeholders like pension fund panel members who are incredibly busy. And this is only a tiny piece of their agenda. That just speeds the education. And I think it's interesting, back to policy, this focus on training and on continuous learning and trustee training, etc. At the pension fund panel stage, that cannot be achieved if we don't kind of demystify some of this highly technical body of work. So again, a constant reminder of that. I think, unfortunately, this is something we do need to remind ourselves of constantly, though, because it can get forgotten in the industry talk. I'd love to move on to some reflection questions now. And you've spoken a bit about your career, and I think you were very candid and open at the beginning about setbacks and challenges, given you wanted to pursue a certain path and it wasn't to be. Anything that you can reflect on as highs and lows, or maybe any takeaways from those lows?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I've learned more recently in life is about perspective and always keeping everything in perspective. Obviously, we all take our work seriously and we want to do a really good job, but I've always tried to remind myself that at the end of the day, it's work, and there are bigger things in life that are more important, your personal relationships, your family, and your mental health. So it's a lot easier to say than to do, and try and keep a relatively healthy work-life balance. It's not easy as a CEO, but I try my best. I try to always be humble. I think I'm pretty good at being humble, but I think it's an important quality. And also, another thing I've sort of learned along the way is to try not to be too knocked back by mistakes or by setbacks. It's really easy to take things really sort of personally and let them really dwell on things and really take those things to heart. And I think, again, it's about that perspective. The way I look at it is, if you take something from a mistake or a setback and you learn from it, then it's a positive experience. As painful as it might have been, you've learned something, you've grown from it, and you can move forward taking that with you and hopefully not doing the same. If it was a mistake you made, you won't do that again. The lows generally have related to people, I've always found, and having to make those difficult decisions that you have to make when you're in a leadership position. Often there's people you work with who you really want to help and support and bring along and get them to a point where they're really effective in a role. And for some people, they're just not the right fit. And it's, those kind of decisions and those kind of conversations are genuinely real lows, I think, where it's easy to feel some sense of failure as a leader, as a manager, to think I couldn't get them to the place that they needed to be. In terms of highs, I would say definitely when I received the award last autumn at the LPFA Investments Awards. That was so unexpected. I was stunned by it, but I was so grateful for it. Once I'd had a chance to reflect on it and to really sort of take on what that meant and what that meant, how people saw me and the respect they had for me, that was just a brilliant point in my career. And also getting the role of being LPFA's CEO, sometimes I still have to pinch myself. These are things I never thought I would do in my life or my career. So yeah, definite highs.
Well, I think very well deserved that award. I don't think any of us would have doubted that, but thank you for sharing that. And I think, it gets back to what you said about paid internships. mean, clearly as a leader, you are deeply invested in the people you lead and in ensuring that even at the entry level, there's a dignity and a validation of that role and the importance of it. I'd love to just ask then about mentorship. Clearly, it seems you've been a mentor many times, but was there any one or two people in particular that really shaped your career path?
There's nobody that I can think of in particular. There's lots of people I've looked up to and learned from along the way. I've always been lucky to have the backing of my family as I sort of explored various avenues of my career and never quite knew what I was going to be doing, but always felt like I had their support. So that was really important to me. But I've always taken as much as I could and learned as much as I could from those I worked with. I can think of people along the way in every job that I've had who've been brilliant supports. I'm a bit of a sponge. I ask a lot of questions. So, I know when I went into pensions, I felt like I was asking too many questions, but my manager at the time said to me, no, questions are good, questions are good. And then once I got more experienced and became that person, teaching people, I realized how right he was, that the more you ask questions and inquire about things, it shows you're engaging with the subject matter and you're developing your own understanding. So there's almost like there's too many people to mention, but I feel like I've taken a lot from the people who I've worked with and who've supported me along the way, and I wouldn't be where I am without them. So grateful to all of those people.
I'm sure the feeling is mutual there. And just to close us out, I know you've given us a lot of wisdom already in this podcast, but is there any creed or motto or word of wisdom, advice for your younger self that you can leave us with here?
So for me, I always think about how I was brought up, what my parents taught me, and largely it was about respect. Have respect for everybody and treat others as you want to be treated yourself. And that's something I've always lived by, and it hasn't done me harm at all, behaving in that way. In terms of advice for my younger self, I would say go for it and believe in yourself. At times, I didn't necessarily believe in myself and I didn't always go for it. But I do think, looking back on life, I do count myself as quite lucky, even though I faced some really, really difficult times personally over the last 5-6 years. I don't have any regrets in life. I'm happy, I'm content with the decisions I've made along the way. And I've ended up in a pretty good place, I think.
Well, very well said. And I've taken a lot away from this podcast. First is an immediate interest in finding out what happens at a motorbike race, because having never been at one and being from the south of Ireland, I feel I may have missed out on some great excitement, something quite stimulating there. And I think it's interesting also that you had your roots in international law, because I studied law, but not particularly international law. But I've always thought of that as an area with some very kind of overarching moral grounding and compass and a kind of a sense of the arc of justice. I've heard that through our discussion, your commitment to public service, not only to the underlying beneficiaries, but also to a working governance structure and to the people you work with. So thank you so much for your ongoing service. I think we are in very safe hands when you think of the evolution of the LGPS and in London in particular. And thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Aoife. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for asking.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.